Hi there. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I am going to narrate to you 3 true Home Alone on rainy night horror stories. These tales of terror will have you on the edge of your seat as we explore eerie encounters that took place during stormy nights. Imagine being alone at home with the sound of rain tapping on the windows, only to realize that you're not as alone as you thought. Get ready for a spine-chilling journey into the unknown. If you love real horror stories and creepy true tales, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this podcast to stay updated on all my latest content. Now let's dive into the darkness together.
Story 1. The Haunting of Cedar Hollow.
Jacob Palmer was a 28-year-old man living in the charming town of Cedar Hollow, Massachusetts. He had moved to Cedar Hollow a year ago, seeking a quiet life away from the hustle and bustle of the big city. Jacob worked as a freelance graphic designer, spending most of his days in his cozy home office. His house was an old Victorian-style home, perched on a hill, surrounded by dense woods. It was the perfect place for someone who valued peace and solitude. But as October rolled in, bringing with it a series of relentless rainstorms, Jacob's peaceful existence was about to be shattered. One cold, rainy afternoon, Jacob was engrossed in a Zoom meeting with a client. The rain pattered incessantly against the windows, and the sky was a gloomy gray. Suddenly, at precisely 1 p.m., the power in his house went out. The screen of his laptop went dark, and the room was plunged into an eerie silence. Jacob glanced around, confused, and noticed that all the lights were out. He quickly grabbed his phone and used its flashlight to find his way to the window. Peering through the rain-streaked glass, Jacob saw that all the neighboring houses still had their lights on. A sense of unease settled over him. Something was wrong with his house. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jacob fetched a stronger flashlight from his kitchen drawer and headed down to the basement. The basement was a labyrinth of old furniture and storage boxes, creating a maze that Jacob carefully navigated. He reached the electrical panel and saw that the main power switch was in the off position. This struck him as odd, as he knew that such switches usually only trip halfway, not fully off. He hesitated for a moment, then flicked the switch back to the on position. Instantly, the lights came back on, and the hum of electricity filled the house. Relieved, Jacob closed the panel and returned upstairs to his office. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully, with Jacob immersing himself in his work. As the hours ticked by, the storm outside intensified, and darkness fell upon Cedar Hollow. Lightning flashed periodically, casting brief, ghostly illuminations through the windows. Jacob worked late into the night, finally shutting his laptop at 8 p.m. He stretched and decided it was time for a break. As Jacob opened his office door, he heard a series of thumps coming from downstairs. Initially, he dismissed it as the wind or something hitting the house. But then, the power cut out again. This time, Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He stood still, listening intently. The house was deathly silent except for the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. Even the thumping noises had ceased. With a growing sense of dread, Jacob grabbed his flashlight once more and made his way to the basement door. He opened it and descended the creaky wooden steps. The sound of the storm was much louder down here, almost deafening. He swept the beam of his flashlight around the room and noticed something alarming: a puddle of water on the floor. Jacob's mind raced as he approached the electrical panel. The water appeared to be coming from a window well above a stack of boxes. The window was open and rainwater was pouring in. But what really made his blood run cold were the muddy footprints on top of the boxes. Someone had used them to climb in and out of the window. Panic set in as Jacob spun around, shining his flashlight frantically around the basement. He felt eyes watching him from the shadows. His imagination conjured up images of a hidden intruder lurking just out of sight. Without thinking, Jacob bolted up the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed his car keys and ran outside, locking himself in his car. Shaking, Jacob called the police. They arrived within 10 minutes, combing through the house and finding no one. However, they confirmed that someone had indeed broken in, pointing out the loosened screws on the window well. The officers reset the window and advised Jacob to stay vigilant and report any further incidents. Days passed, and Jacob couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He installed new locks and security cameras, hoping to deter any future intruders. But the eerie atmosphere in his home persisted. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, made him jumpy and paranoid. One night, about a week after the break-in, Jacob was awoken by a strange noise. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the basement. He sat up in bed, straining to hear. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Mustering his courage, Jacob grabbed his flashlight and cautiously made his way downstairs. The house was dark and silent, the only sound the relentless tapping. Jacob reached the basement door and hesitated. His hand trembled as he turned the knob and descended the steps. The tapping was louder now, echoing through the basement. He followed the sound to the far corner, where a stack of old furniture was covered with a dusty sheet. Jacob pulled the sheet away, revealing an old, ornate mirror leaning against the wall. The tapping was coming from the other side of the mirror. Heart pounding, he shone his flashlight at the glass. His reflection stared back at him, but something was off. The eyes of his reflection were filled with fear, and its mouth moved, silently forming words. Jacob stepped closer, his breath fogging up the glass. He placed his hand on the mirror, and his reflection did the same. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold, and the tapping stopped. The reflection's hand seemed to press harder against the glass, as if trying to break through. In a flash of realization, Jacob remembered the stories he had heard about the old Victorian houses in Cedar Hollow. They said some of the houses were haunted by restless spirits, trapped between worlds. He had always dismissed such tales as mere folklore, but now, staring into the eyes of his terrified reflection, he began to believe. Determined to uncover the truth, Jacob spent the next day researching the history of his house. He discovered that it once belonged to a man named Edward Blackwood, who mysteriously disappeared in the late 1800s. According to legend, Edward was an occultist who dabbled in dark rituals. Locals believed he had trapped himself in a mirror during one of his experiments, and his spirit had been haunting the house ever since. That night, Jacob prepared for a confrontation. He set up candles around the mirror and placed a bundle of sage on the floor. He had read that burning sage could cleanse a space of negative energy. As the clock struck midnight, Jacob lit the sage and began to chant a cleansing prayer he had found online. The air grew thick and heavy, and the temperature dropped further. The mirror's surface shimmered, and Jacob's reflection began to twist and distort. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the glass, a gaunt, spectral man with hollow eyes and a look of desperation on his face. It was Edward Blackwood. Edward's ghost reached out, his fingers brushing Jacob's hand. "Help me," he whispered, his voice echoing in the stillness. Jacob nodded, continuing his chant. The candles flickered, and the room filled with a blinding light. When the light faded, the mirror was empty. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted the house lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. Jacob knew that Edward's spirit had finally found rest. In the days that followed, Jacob felt a renewed sense of security in his home. The rainstorms continued, but they no longer seemed ominous. Cedar Hollow returned to its quiet, sleepy self, and Jacob went back to his work, grateful for the peace that had been restored. Yet, every now and then, when the rain was particularly heavy, Jacob would glance at the old mirror in the basement. He knew that Cedar Hollow was a place where history lingered, and though Edward's spirit was at rest, the town held many more secrets waiting to be uncovered.
Story 2. The Stranger in the Woods.
The year was 2019, and Michael Turner had decided to take a trip to northern Wisconsin. Michael, a 30-year-old software engineer, had been feeling burnt out from his demanding job. He longed for a peaceful escape, and an Airbnb cabin located in the secluded woods near the Canada-US border seemed like the perfect retreat. The cabin was part of a park with several similar cabins, all owned by the same person. Although the area around the cabin was remote, the nearest store was only a 10-minute drive away. Each cabin had its own trail leading up to it, offering privacy and tranquility. For the first couple of days, Michael enjoyed the solitude, spending his time inside the cabin or walking along the forest trails. But soon, boredom crept in, and he decided to check out the park center, where other guests often gathered. The park center was a simple area with charcoal grills, fire pits, and benches. Michael had noticed groups of people there, laughing and having a good time, and thought it might be nice to join them. He arrived at the park center around 5 p.m. and quickly made friends with a couple of guys named Dave and Charlie. They shared beers and stories around the fire pit, enjoying the camaraderie. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the trees, another man approached the group. He was tall and gaunt, with a weary look in his eyes. Michael, being friendly, offered him a beer and invited him to join them by the fire. The man accepted but seemed distant and uninterested. He didn't talk much and looked uncomfortable, which cast a pall over the cheerful atmosphere. After a while, Dave and Charlie decided to call it a night and headed back to their cabins, leaving Michael alone with the stranger. Michael tried to make conversation, but the man remained aloof, staring into the flames with a tired expression. Eventually, Michael stood up, put out the fire, and said he was heading back to his cabin. The stranger just sat there, watching him with a vacant stare. Michael felt a chill run down his spine, but forced a smile and walked away. As he made his way down the trail, he glanced back a few times, noticing the man still watching him. Each time he looked, the man quickly turned his head away, pretending not to stare. Fortunately, the trail to Michael's cabin was well lit by outdoor lamps, and he didn't think the man followed him. Michael returned to his cabin, feeling uneasy but trying to shake it off. He took a quick shower and sat in the living room for a while, scrolling through his phone. After a few beers earlier, he felt tired and decided to go to bed. He quickly fell asleep, but was abruptly awoken in the middle of the night. At first, Michael was disoriented, unsure of what had woken him. He rolled over to look at the clock, but his eyes caught sight of a figure standing in the open doorway to his bedroom. The room was dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the window, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he recognized the man from the fire pit. The stranger's silhouette was motionless, and for a moment, they stared at each other in silence. Then the man spoke, his voice broken and harsh. "I need to stay here," he said. Michael was terrified and confused, struggling to find his voice. He stammered out a few words, but the man repeated himself, more forcefully this time. "I need to stay here." Michael realized the man was unpredictable and possibly dangerous. He slowly got out of bed, careful not to make any sudden moves. Now, with his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Michael could see the man's face more clearly. He looked even more exhausted and disheveled than before, with sweat dripping down his forehead. They locked eyes for a few moments, then the man stepped back into the hallway, giving Michael space to leave. But Michael noticed the man's left hand was stiffly held to his side, as if hiding something. Fear coursed through Michael's veins, but he kept his composure. He quickly walked past the man and out of the bedroom. As he rounded the corner, he glanced back to see the stranger still standing in the hallway, watching him leave. Michael didn't waste any time. He ran down the trail and headed straight for the park center, hoping someone would be there. Luckily, a group of people was gathered around a fire pit, enjoying a late-night drink. Michael breathlessly explained what had happened and asked them to call 911. Within minutes, the police arrived and searched the cabin. They found the man still standing in the hallway, clutching a knife in his left hand. The police took the man into custody and brought him to the station for questioning. His answers were incoherent, and he seemed mentally unstable. They concluded that he was suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. Michael was shaken, but relieved that the situation had been resolved without violence. The police later discovered that the man, whose name was Jonathan Hayes, had been living in the woods for weeks. He had lost his job and home and had been wandering aimlessly, driven to desperation. Jonathan's mind had fractured under the weight of his troubles, leading him to seek shelter in Michael's cabin. Michael's peaceful retreat had turned into a nightmare, but he was grateful for the instincts that had kept him safe. He decided to cut his trip short and returned home the next day, leaving the secluded cabin and its haunting memories behind. Back in the city, Michael couldn't shake the experience from his mind. He often thought about Jonathan and wondered what had driven him to such a desperate state. Michael hoped that Jonathan would get the help he needed and find some semblance of peace. As time passed, Michael found himself more appreciative of the safety and comfort of his own home. The eerie encounter in the woods had left a lasting impression, a reminder of the thin line between reality and the unknown. And although Michael never returned to that secluded cabin, the memory of the stranger in the woods would stay with him forever, a chilling tale of desperation and the haunting echoes of a troubled mind.
Story 3. The Silent Neighbor.
In the heart of suburban Pennsylvania, nestled within a quiet community, lived a young man named Caleb Mitchell. Caleb, a 25-year-old graphic designer, had been living in his cozy duplex for over a year. He enjoyed the peace and quiet, especially since his neighbors had moved out just a month after he moved in. The adjoining unit remained vacant, which made Caleb feel like he had the entire place to himself. One chilly evening, Caleb finished his shift at work and picked up some fast food on his way home. The clock struck 10 p.m. as he walked through his front door, his stomach growling with anticipation. Caleb plopped down on the couch, turned on the TV, and began devouring his dinner. The soft glow of the television cast flickering shadows around the room, creating a serene ambience. But then, a quiet thud came from behind him. Caleb paused, looking at the wall that separated his duplex from the empty unit next door. The thud happened again, a little louder this time. Intrigued and slightly concerned, Caleb muted the TV and went to the window, peering out into the dark driveway. There were no cars, no moving trucks, and no lights on in the other unit. Everything seemed normal, except for the mysterious noises. Caleb leaned his ear against the wall. The sounds were muffled but unmistakable. He could hear soft footsteps and the faint creak of doors opening and closing, as if someone was inspecting the empty duplex. A shiver ran down his spine. The other unit had been vacant for over a year, and it was nearly 11 p.m. Why would anyone be there now? With nothing else to do, Caleb returned to his couch and tried to focus on his show. The minutes ticked by, but his mind kept wandering back to the noises. Eventually, exhaustion overcame curiosity, and Caleb decided to go to bed. He tossed and turned, trying to shake off the unease, but the sounds continued to echo in his mind. Just as Caleb began to drift off, a loud thud jolted him awake. He sat up, staring at the wall. The noise was louder and more insistent than before. Heart pounding, Caleb got up and walked to his bedroom door. Before he opened it, he heard another sound. Soft footsteps slowly making their way across the floor downstairs. A cold fear gripped Caleb. He stepped away from the door and grabbed his phone from the nightstand. With trembling hands, he turned the volume down and called the police, whispering his address to the operator. He tried to explain the situation, but his words caught in his throat as a shadow appeared under the door. Caleb's breath hitched. The shadow moved slowly, cautiously. Whoever was on the other side seemed to know he was in the room. They walked back and forth in the hallway, their footsteps barely making a sound. Caleb remained silent, hoping the police would arrive before it was too late. Minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, the intruder's footsteps grew louder and quicker, as if they no longer cared about being quiet. They moved through the hallway, opening doors to the other rooms. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as the intruder reached his door, twisting the handle and trying to force it open. When the door wouldn't budge, the intruder moved on, heading downstairs and repeating the same actions. Finally, the front door creaked open and the intruder left. Caleb let out a shaky breath, still clutching his phone. The police arrived shortly after, but by then, the intruder was long gone. They searched the house and found that a few small items had been stolen, but nothing of great value. It was clear the intruder had been more interested in something else. A few weeks later, while cleaning the spare bedroom, Caleb found a small camera hidden under one of the nightstands. His blood ran cold. Someone had been spying on him. He took the camera to the police, but they couldn't trace it or determine what information had been recorded. The discovery left Caleb feeling violated and paranoid. Months passed, and there were no signs of the intruder returning. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, sent his heart racing. He installed new locks and security cameras, hoping to regain a sense of safety. One stormy night, Caleb was jolted awake by a familiar sound, a soft thud coming from the wall. His eyes snapped open, and he listened intently. The noises were back, louder and more insistent than ever. Caleb grabbed his flashlight and crept downstairs, determined to confront whatever was haunting him. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Caleb's flashlight flickered on, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He followed the sounds to the kitchen, where he saw the back door slightly ajar. A gust of wind blew it open, revealing the dark, rain-soaked backyard. Caleb's heart pounded as he stepped outside, the rain drenching his clothes. He shone the flashlight around, searching for any signs of the intruder. The beam of light caught movement near the edge of the woods. Caleb froze, his breath catching in his throat. A figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured by a hood. They stood still, watching Caleb with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. Gathering his courage, Caleb called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure remained silent, then turned and disappeared into the woods. Caleb's fear turned to determination. He wasn't going to let this mystery haunt him any longer. He followed the figure, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The woods were dense and foreboding, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. Caleb's footsteps squelched in the mud as he navigated the undergrowth. The rain continued to pour, soaking him to the bone. He pressed on, driven by a mixture of fear and resolve. Finally, he reached a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated shed. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Caleb hesitated, then stepped inside. The smell of damp wood and decay filled his nostrils. Inside the shed, he found a makeshift living area, a cot, some canned food, and a small table with a stack of old photographs. Caleb's eyes widened as he recognized himself in some of the pictures. They had been taken without his knowledge, documenting his daily life. A rustling sound behind him made Caleb whirl around. The hooded figure stood in the doorway, their face still hidden. Caleb's fear turned to anger. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded. The figure slowly pulled back their hood, revealing a weathered face with piercing eyes. "You need to leave," the stranger said, their voice rough and urgent. "This place isn't safe." Caleb was taken aback. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The stranger stepped closer, urgency in their voice. "My name is Eli. I used to live in that duplex. Strange things started happening. I was driven out. I came back to warn you." Caleb's mind raced. "Warn me about what?" Eli looked around nervously. "This land is cursed. There's something in the woods, something that feeds on fear. It drove me away, and now it's coming for you." Caleb's skepticism battled with his fear. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Eli shook his head. "I tried, but it wouldn't let me. It's stronger now. You need to leave before it's too late." Suddenly, a chilling howl echoed through the woods, freezing Caleb and Eli in their tracks. The air grew colder, and a palpable sense of dread filled the clearing. Eli grabbed Caleb's arm. "Run!" They sprinted through the woods, the howling growing louder and more menacing. The trees seemed to close in around them, branches clawing at their clothes. Caleb's heart pounded as he pushed himself to keep up with Eli. Finally, they burst out of the woods and back onto the trail leading to the duplex. Caleb's lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but he didn't stop until they reached the safety of his front door. Eli looked at him, eyes wide with fear. "Get out of here, Caleb. Don't come back." Caleb nodded, breathless and terrified. He watched as Eli disappeared into the night, leaving him alone on the doorstep. Without wasting another moment, Caleb packed his essentials, jumped into his car, and sped away from the duplex, never looking back. In the weeks that followed, Caleb moved to a new city, far away from the cursed woods. He never forgot Eli's warning or the horrors he had experienced. The memory of that fateful night stayed with him, a reminder of the unseen terrors that lurk in the shadows, waiting to feed on fear.
Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to listen to similar stories in future.